everyone, and welcome to Another Bite, where we rewatch the most innovative and intriguing pitches from Shark Tank. I'm Jorie, and I'm joined by the agreeable, the adventurous, and the affable Ariel.
Hey, everyone.
Ariel, why did the hamburger go to the gym? To get better buns, of course.
Oh my gosh.
And speaking of buns, will today's new spin on the American classic, the hamburger, have the shark saying, "You're the bun that I want," or will these founders meet their match? We'll find out after this sizzling ad. Finding a service solution that helps you better connect with customers and keep them happy can feel impossible. Like trying to remember the name of that guy you met at a networking event. Was it Ron? Or could it be Don? Or John? Maybe Sean? Yeah, that kind of impossible. HubSpot's all-new Service Hub can help. Well, in the service solution part, at least. It brings service and success together in one powerful platform for the first time ever. With an AI-powered help desk and an AI chatbot that handles frontline tickets fast. Plus, it comes with a customer success workspace that helps reps anticipate customer needs and a full 360 view of every customer, so your go-to-market team can keep a pulse on accounts trying to upsell or cross-sell. Also, you can scale support and drive revenue and retention. And you know what that means: better service and happier customers at every stage of their journey. Visit HubSpot.com/service so you can do more with your customers today. Today in the tank, we have RoboBurger. And RoboBurger is brought to us by founders Andy, Dan, and Audley. And they're asking for $1.5 million for 5% of their business, which is Ariel, this is the $30 million valuation. And the problem that these founders are trying to solve for is that it's really hard to find hot food in remote places, off hours. You know, kitchen staffs, they're expensive, lots of overhead. You hate to see it at your favorite burger joint. So their solution is, well, a vending machine. But this electric, robotic miniature restaurant is a fully autonomous burger joint where essentially you can get a burger cooked for you and customized for you in under 4 minutes. So it is very futuristic. It's a robotic vending machine that just gives you a piping hot burger where they can cook anything any year round. And they have 4 patents on this wonderful device. So thinking about our pitch, our founders, and our lovely sizzling product, Ariel, initial thoughts of RoboBurger.
This is of the future. I feel like this is something that you would get from like reading a sci-fi fiction book where you hear about like the automated food. And look, there's nothing wrong with wanting to leverage technology to accelerate efficiencies when it comes to reducing overhead costs in restaurants. Like there's a lot of valuable pros, I think, behind the initial intent of the product coming into market, but the actual execution of it, I think there's some challenges, Jorie. I think in the past, we've talked about other vending machine type products. More often than not, those are usually for like beverages or like boba tea or like cotton candy. Like the whole concept of having like a robo chef or like a robotic kitchen isn't necessarily new. I think the biggest challenge that they're going to run into is one, that they're going to have to try to convince folks to be okay with getting meat served to them through a robot, which doesn't really sound super appetizing, especially given how quick it's made. So you really have to like reassure to consumers that, you know, hey, you need to buy into this concept of having your meat made by an instant like vending machine that you may or may not know is serviced or maintained well enough. I think the second piece is also the maintenance component that comes into it. With a lot of these types of vending machine businesses, there's a lot of overhead costs that come from maintenance, cleanliness standards, and the fact that they're handling meat, I actually think makes them a little more susceptible to like food inspections. I think there's a lot of challenges that come with trying to push a meat-based product into like a vending machine kind of format. But Jorie, I don't know about you. Would you eat a burger from a vending machine or would you pass?
Okay. Yeah. So at first I was a little confused about how this actually works. So like, let's run down the conveyor belt. So basically it's not cooking the meat from scratch, right? Like they tried to use buzzwords where they're like, no, it's rethermalized. And then Mark was like, don't you just mean reheated? And like, essentially, yes, right? So it's like they're loading this machine up with pre-cooked meat and then it like puts on like fresh lettuce, tomato, onion, you have it with the condiments and stuff. But I mean, it is in Jorie lore that I am very food skeptical when it comes to things that are automated, shall we say. So I had some initial concerns also because it was a meat product. I just think that like the amount of bacteria that could introduce to it might just be like their biggest hurdle in terms of like consumer concerns. They'd have to make sure it was like absolutely pristine. I'm not sure how they could really visually do that besides health inspection stickers or even making like the conveyor belt more visible. I was like, if this was a transparent machine, would I trust it more? And it's like, that could go honestly either way, depending on how this works on the inside. So I think I had a lot of your similar like skepticism in terms of how much this might concern or drive away certain consumers, but then also on the flip side of that, how they were going to really make this an exciting opportunity. I know their big differentiator is that there's no overhead to this machine. So in that way, I was like, oh, this is like definitely kind of more of a licensing play where they're going to try to partner with like big chain restaurants like McDonald's. And I could sort of see like the McDonald's vending machine on the corner. But I think, honestly, without that kind of big name draw, they'd really struggle because A, hamburgers is such a crowded market already. And then B, this is just not something that's like widely available in America right now. So like your average American would need a lot more education on why this is something that they can trust and go to and get really good food. Like I think we've talked about other markets before, like Japan has a lot of automation, a lot of like vending machine business models that are really popular and that are really successful. I just think that it's asking for a pretty big change in consumer buying behavior. And for that reason, they just have a lot of marketing legwork to do.
This is definitely more of like a licensing play because you're right. You're educating the consumer to not only have trust in your brand that like RoboBurgers are, healthy, like I won't get sick from them, but you're also educating that consumer to be more comfortable with eating food out of a vending machine. Whereas like to your point, like maybe in a lot of international markets, like in Japan, like that's a little bit more like normalized. It's a little bit more like ingrained in society. It's like people already are kind of conditioned to already accept purchasing food from vending machine. But in the United States, like where there's such a focus on, we want to see the process or we want things fresh. I feel like it's almost actually counter to a lot of like American culture. So I think you have to think about like the cultural like impact. But I love the idea of like franchising the technology potentially, because I think the other thing that they don't really hit at is the burger itself is customizable to an extent, right? Like I think Barbara called this out of like, I don't really want a well-done burger. Are there any like other options that I could like customize, like the meat temperature? The strongest point for them to kind of lean into is how do we kind of franchise this out to either like a Shake Shack or a McDonald's, even to your point, to like make sure that folks, feel confident in like what they're getting without having to build in all this functionality for like customization and while also trying to maintain the taste of the burger and the quality of it.
Yeah. And I think that that's what they need to do, right? Is it's like they need to get proximity to a brand that's already trusted, right? Because I actually think that that's going to overcome a lot of these initial concerns where it's like, oh, but it's McDonald's, right? And I've had McDonald's before and I know the experience of a McDonald's burger. So of course I wouldn't think too much about it if like there's this new trend versus just like essentially an unbranded burger just appearing in a vending machine on a random street. It just might have a little bit more of an issue getting folks really excited. But then you mentioned licensing. And I think a pretty big part of this pitch was actually unpacking how this business really worked. Now, this is one of those times when I was watching Shark Tank and I was like, I feel like there's some clever editing or manipulation of storyline. I feel like there was a lot we didn't see because at first, it seemed really straightforward, right? Like we get that the cost of leasing a cluster of these machines, they're leasing usually like 4 at a time, and each machine is $3,000 per month per machine. The client deals with the overhead of the actual food costs. That actually made sense to me. They're in this beta phase. I think they're really just working on this pricing. At this point, I was like, especially if you're going B2B, no initial concerns with that cost. You're going to have like big conglomerates like Google foot that kind of bill. They're selling, burgers for $6.99. Honestly, again, not a big pricing concern.
Especially with inflation these days.
But yeah, I know. $6.99. It's like, I might even actually be interested in it, even if it is a burnt burger, whatever. But I feel like at this point, the sharks just start interrupting, right? And they're like, that's confusing. What are you doing? How many burgers? I feel like sometimes we see founders come onto Shark Tank and they kind of forget in the moment some of their numbers or aren't prepared. I didn't get the vibe that these founders didn't know their numbers. It just felt like the sharks, more so than in other episodes in the past, were like really jumping on them and being like, this is too confusing. What is this business model? What were your thoughts of their business model?
I was rewatching it again to kind of see where did it start like breaking down
Falling apart.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it was around the point where they were really pitching like the rethermalization process. We see our founders when they're on the show sometimes fall into this trap of like, hey, I have this really great narrative. I have to make sure I get through these main bullet points that I prepared. And sometimes they don't necessarily practice a lot of active listening when it comes to the sharks asking questions. So when Mr. Wonderful was asking questions around, okay, if I'm your customer, how much does it cost to lease? And they were, trying to focus on other value props or like key messages they want to get across for why this is such an investable business instead of just answering the question up front. I feel like that probably added a little bit of that like contention a bit, but to your point, it seemed like it happened very quickly from like an editing perspective and everything kind of went off the rails really fast. But I think this was just one of those instances where, we have founders that are very, very much so focused to their talk track and not necessarily ready to answer those questions like on the spot or as quickly as the sharks need. And I could understand, I guess, from the sharks' perspective, why they would be a little bit more hesitant if you're like, I can't even get your answer out of you, or like you're not listening to any of like the questions that I have. Why do I think as a partnership wise down the road, you listen to any advice that I have? So I kind of view it as almost like for the sharks, they're kind of interviewing the founders in a way to see like, hey, are you a good fit to enter my portfolio and work with? So while I do think it could have been like a little bit enhanced by production value, I think that there's some truth to it a little bit because it was a very disorganized pitch. Let's be honest. It was kind of all over the place.
Totally fair. Yeah. And I think that too, it might be a classic example of like almost over preparing for your pitch where it's like you have everything memorized. And so when people don't break that flow when you're practicing your pitch, for example, and then you're live and someone breaks that flow, you don't know how to handle it. So I feel like it's actually a really good use case too of be prepared to have to deviate from a specific talk track because they're going to have questions and you run the risk of really losing trust essentially if you're not able to answer them in the moment, but then also kind of continue the flow of like, this is why you should invest in me and my product. But what would these founders need to do to either get you to buy one of these burgers where you're like, oh yeah, I love RoboBurger? Like, what does that marketing look like where you're so excited? Or what's your threshold of foods in vending machines?
Jorie, I would try this. I do love burgers.
Okay, so
I
nothing.
do like well-done meat. So like, that's just Ariel lore. I do like burnt burgers. So like, I would just like try this on my own volition just to like, try it for the lulz. But I think in general, though, I think for me, it would stop at like boba tea drinks and stuff would be my threshold. What about you, Jorie?
I don't think I could do meat from a vending machine. I think that's my hard stop. I feel like they would have to do a lot of marketing with like a brand that I would naturally go to. In-N-Out Burger, sort of like maybe not McDonald's, but maybe then you can rely on like McDonald's and their billion-dollar marketing budget to like drive consumer trust. But I think it would have to be a strategic partnership for me in order to actually get me to buy this burger. I'm also the opposite, Ariel. I can't eat a burnt burger. I can't do it. So it's like Jorie lore is I eat a lot of rare meat. So Jorie has to be very cognizant of where I'm eating because you can't eat raw meat in a lot of places, nor should you try. But it was a bit interesting because much like there's many burger chains, Mark says that this is actually not an interesting business. And basically, a lot of the sharks like umbrage, if you will, with this product is that because technology is moving so quickly, they're not able to innovate fast enough. So Mark's like, you have a lot of competition out there. You're not going to be able to adapt with your like very physical leasing model quick enough. So Mark goes out. Kevin is like, I don't even understand how I'm going to make money. Michael goes out because he just doesn't think it's worth it. Barbara's been in the vending machine game, and apparently these vending machines aren't as reliable as our founders are trying to promote. So one by one, we just ultimately see the sharks start to drop. It was a bit of an interesting one, though, because we found that guest Michael was willing to actually, after all the sharks had gone out, come back onto the scene and actually offer this Shark Tank deal in terms of a loan We get a bit of negotiation as soon as the loans and royalties, those are like the magic words for Kevin, get brought in. He comes back in and we see a joint deal between Kevin and guest shark Michael, where we end up with this like Shark Tank partnership between Michael and Kevin, where they offer $1.5 million for 9% of the company, but as a loan. And surprisingly, in a big turn of events, RoboBurger walks away with a Shark Tank deal. RoboBurger coming to a corner near you.
I'm just very surprised that they ended up doing a deal. I don't think RoboBurger will ever be a burger chain or name that's like a household name, but I do think that could be a really great way to like expand kind of their reach overall.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
So much sense. Production for today's episode was brought to you by Arie Desormeaux. Editing comes from Robert Hartwig and support from Alfred Schulz. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or wherever you subscribe to the greatest podcasts ever. That does it for me. See you next week in the tank for another bite. Create Like the Greats, hosted by Ross Simmons, is brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. Each episode hosts an in-depth analysis of some of the greatest creations and creators of all time, along with deep dive conversations on the creative process that went into building companies and brands. If you like learning about history or learning about the creative process, you'll like this podcast. Listen to Create Like the Greats wherever you get your podcasts.